Thank you very much. Is this working properly?
Yes.
Yeah? Cool. It is wonderful to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about this project. It's close to my heart because I've worked in the Caribbean region for so long, and especially I've spent a lot of time focused on these species that you guys know really well, and that are the most common shark species in the Caribbean. They also have really interesting stories that you guys are probably familiar with to some degree, and hopefully there's some new information in there today. This project has been very collaborative amongst everyone in our entire lab at Scripps, so I want to thank Christian, Bryce, and Lily who are here today. Everyone has chipped in their own unique set of skills to put together some of these trends that I think are foundational to conservation planning for sharks and rays in the Caribbean in the future. I'll start out with a broad overview of how sharks and rays are doing at the global level. I don't think this will be new information necessarily, but hopefully it provides an update. As you know, sharks and rays are not doing particularly well. It's estimated now that for every 2 individuals of sharks and their relatives, the rays and chimeras, that were swimming around in 1970, by 2019 there was only 1 remaining. So this doesn't hold for every species, but across the board this group is not doing very well, and it's largely due to overfishing. The current estimate is that over 80 million sharks are killed every year. That's both through targeted and accidental interactions with fisheries. And for many species, that level of mortality is too much. It's too high. We're killing them too fast. They can't withstand that level of mortality. They can't keep up with it because they typically have conservative or what we refer to as slow life histories, meaning they mature late in life and they have very few pups. There are some species here in the Caribbean that don't mature until they're around 15, even 20 years old. Then they might have 1 or 2 pups every 2 or 3 years with long waiting periods in between pregnancies, and they can live till 80 or more. So that probably sounds pretty similar to a human life history, actually, more so than a marine fish that's typically caught and pursued by fisheries. And so you can imagine these situations where lots of fishes are being targeted and fished even sustainably. If sharks are caught accidentally at the same time, those populations will go down, and it takes a long time for them to recover. This threat of overfishing is pronounced in coastal regions really close to human population centers. The easier it is for us to access them, the worse off their populations tend to be. And the threat of mortality has actually increased in tropical and subtropical regions along coastlines. For a long time, and I think many others have thought of this issue of shark mortality as being very much out of sight, out of mind, as kind of falling on the shoulders of the high seas international fleets that are out in the middle of the Pacific, and we don't see them very much, but they're killing sharks all the time. Mortality in those regions has actually gone down in the last 10 years or so. It's increased in coastal regions, in places where people really just need to make a living and get a source of protein, and sharks and rays have supplied that in a lot of cases. Unfortunately, that fishing is often unsustainable. Coral reefs are some of those habitats, along with the seagrass beds and mangrove forests, where a lot of these tropical and subtropical species live, and they're also within easy reach of people in big cities. And so sharks that live in some of these habitats are not doing very well at all. There's a big effort called Global Fin Print that's happened in the last decade or so, where scientists collaboratively all around the world with local partners have put out baited video units on coral reefs all over the world, and it's estimated that 20% of those surveyed reefs have no sharks whatsoever. These are places where sharks used to occur. You would expect to find reef sharks and reef-associated rays in these places, and yet you see none, according to the Global Fin Print data. Overall, the current assessment is that over half of all reef-associated shark species are considered threatened with extinction. That, according to the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which is probably familiar to many of you. This is a very important source of assessment information. This relies on standardized, quantitative, and peer-reviewed assessments, this IUCN Red List process. And species, as they're evaluated, go into some of these different categories that you probably see. This is often at at zoos and aquariums. It's probably in this room, actually. So if a species is evaluated, it can go into a category from data deficient, if there's not enough data to really figure out where it belongs, where its conservation status lies. If there is adequate data, it can go anywhere from least concern to critically endangered, with those 3 categories in the middle, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered being considered a threatened category. So if you hear something is threatened with extinction, that means it's in one of those. In the Caribbean, we have no sharks and rays that, as of yet, have become extinct in the wild or extinct. The IUCN Red List assessments are incredibly important worldwide. They are foundational for conservation planning and prioritizing species in fisheries management plans, particularly in countries where there's not a really good fishery management infrastructure, where they don't have the institutional capacity at the local level to do assessments like this on their own, and instead they rely on what the IUCN actually says. And so in some cases, even in the Caribbean, there are countries that base their entire fisheries laws on IUCN Red List status. So if, for example, a species is considered threatened by the IUCN, there will be a fishing prohibition that immediately kicks into place for that species. Bottom line, IUCN status is really, really important, and it's central to our story today. The global trend of shark and ray overfishing is evident in the Caribbean. This is a place where there's been intense shark and ray fishing for many decades, with landings peaking in the 80s and 90s, and then coming down quite a bit by the mid-2010s. That's both because of good fisheries management going into place, as well as actual declines in the amount of animals available to be caught. This is demonstrated really well through actually some photos that I saw, a few of them in that book over there. But these are kind of classic photos of trophy catches in the Florida Keys that demonstrate the reduction in apex predators and large reef-associated predators through time, as well as a decrease in their size. So this is from the 1950s. You can see a lot of big fishes there, including a big hammerhead. This is in the 1980s, and this is in the mid-2000s. So this is representative of the types of trends that we're seeing in the Caribbean region. And a lot of the decline in these species even happened before we started collecting records. So there's cool work looking at that, but it's difficult to pin down. So at the global and regional level, these animals are not doing well. But the Caribbean is incredibly complex. There is so much going on in this region. You can see that just by looking at the map. Things vary in space as well as in time. And there's been a lot of really good work in the Caribbean region that shows us which factors can predict whether you will find sharks and rays on a reef or not, and how many will be on that reef. I think of them as being in three broad categories. The first is the fisheries management in that place. Does a country have species-specific prohibitions, catch limits, size quotas? Does it do anything at all? Does it ban shark fishing throughout the entire EEZ? These are all options on the table. What are the human population pressures? You know, is it a country with a huge population on a small island where they do a lot of fishing? The further you are from those places, the more remote the reef, the better you expect these populations to be. And finally, the animals themselves. We can't forget the species-specific ecology varies too. Some species of shark actually can withstand a moderate level of fishing pressure. They have lots of offspring, they reproduce rather quickly, they reach sexual maturity early in life. Some species move a whole lot, and so even if they're safe in one country, they may get caught by a fishery in another. Others are fairly resident, so if they stay in a protected place, they'll be protected throughout their life. All these things come together to influence how sharks and rays are doing. Again, there is lots and lots of variability in space and time. And so I'll give you an example, first diving into the fisheries management in this region. There are 50 management units. You can't categorize the Caribbean in a succinct way. And I'll demonstrate some of that complexity today. Each of these places has its own unique story, its own cultural use of sharks and rays, its own values, leaning towards ecotourism or fisheries or something else. And we've actually mapped this out in past work where we've quantified the engagement of each country with the fisheries management toolbox for sharks and rays. And you can see that there's a huge spectrum here. There are some highly engaged countries that use almost every tool in the toolbox. They're party to international treaties like Sightings. They have species-specific prohibitions. A country like the US, for example. There are countries in the middle that might not have so much institutional capacity, and maybe the funding isn't there for fisheries management. So some of these countries might lean towards more like blanket prohibitions, right? A much simpler tool. They're not engaged with all of them, but they take one that's kind of a blanket type tool. Or some that just don't do a whole lot to begin with. And then there are the poorly engaged countries where, to be quite honest, shark and ray conservation is not a priority. There are much more pressing issues, and in those places, sharks and rays are doing the worst. This story of sharks and rays is intricately tied to how people are doing. The better off people are doing, the more economically advanced a country, typically the more sharks and rays you find. I see these countries as moving into three general trajectories. There are three buckets that they fall into in my mind. One is those poorly engaged countries. They're not doing a whole lot for sharks and rays for many reasons. There's intense fishing, there has been in the past, and maybe there still is now. There's fishing only. There's only extractive use of sharks and rays. There's no non-extractive use. These are places that probably most of us in the room have not been to dive and do surveys. In these places, you'd expect the shark and ray populations to be in decline. Either those declines happened in the past or they're still happening today. The second bucket, you've got full protection, something like a shark sanctuary. There's no fishing whatsoever, and a country leans into ecotourism. They really value bringing in divers and ecotourists who want to see these animals, and there's a positive feedback there that's encouraging healthy shark and ray populations. How populations are doing there is difficult to say. How effective are those prohibitions? Was there fishing before the prohibition went into place? Does some continue now because there's no enforcement? It's something that needs to be evaluated. In the final bucket, we have the really engaged countries. Countries like the US, for example, there's some fishing, there's also some mixed use. In a place like Florida, right? This is the perfect example. There are directed shark fisheries, recreational and commercial, alongside a vibrant dive ecotourism community, right? Especially off of Jupiter. Now, how are populations doing in a place like this? Again, it needs to be evaluated. It depends when those laws went into place. How effective are they? How effective is enforcement? Some of these countries we can evaluate and answer, we can replace that question mark using REEF survey effort and sightings. Because in those countries, people have gone, you guys have gone to these places and actually looked for sharks and rays and recorded that important information of whether they're there. This bucket of countries down here at the bottom right, we don't have the data to really say what's going on there. And I want to make this point really clear because any trends that I show you today, some of which might be surprisingly positive, are not representative of the worst case scenarios in the Caribbean. Those are places where we truly don't have data to say much of anything. And those are the places where in the FinPrint project, you drop baited video units and nothing swims by. That being said, for those two buckets of countries where things are a little better, we have lots and lots of reef data that can tell us a whole lot about where these animals are in space and time. After cleaning the reef data set extensively and hand-picking the surveys that meet the criteria that we want, we're left with 141,101 reef surveys across the wider Caribbean from which we can gain information on how sharks and rays and all kinds of other reef fishes are doing. This is truly unparalleled. There is no database that comes even close to this. It offers so much for shark and ray conservation. And I want to start by looking at some of those medium survey effort countries. These are countries with 50 to 2,200 surveys over the last 30 years. You can see the trend up there on the far top left. There's thousands of surveys happening every year going back to 1993. These countries, there are 10 of them, right? A lot of these countries, we don't really know what's going on with sharks and rays whatsoever. There's not enough data to look at trends through time in these places because there might be gaps in survey coverage from one year to the next. But there's a lot that we can do in comparing between space. And the metric we're going to use for a couple of these next plots is called sighting frequency. It's the number of dives with a reef-associated shark present. On our list of reef-associated sharks, it's like 10 or 12 species, basically anything you'd expect to find on a coral reef, divided by the total number of dives. So the higher the sighting frequency, more sharks and rays in a place. And we'll start with these medium survey effort countries. And you can see sighting frequency on the left there from 0 to 100%. And then these are stacked from left to right, going from highest sighting frequency to lowest. And what I pull out from these medium survey effort countries is that we really can highlight the countries where we've dove a lot, we've looked for sharks and rays a lot, and yet we see almost nothing. Sightings frequency might be below 5%. And the perfect example here is Bermuda on the far right there, just to give you a sense of how bad it can be in some of these places. There have been over 2,000 surveys in Bermuda over the last 30 years. Does anyone want to take a guess as to how many sharks have been seen on those surveys? 0. Not a single shark has been seen in Bermuda on a reef survey in 30 years of effort. The only elasmobranch, the only shark or ray that's been seen in Bermuda's waters is the white-spotted eagle ray, which I'm told people actually kind of despise in Bermuda, because apparently they're doing all right. I don't know. I need to look into that. I think they're great. That leaves us with 10 places that we have tons and tons of reef data for, over 2,200 surveys, all these different countries I've highlighted here. It's almost too much to even begin to describe. There's so much incredible data. In my past, I've spent years looking at a single one of these types of data sets from one place over like 8 years. This is 30 years from these 10 countries with huge survey effort. It is truly amazing. These countries are from Turks and Caicos to Bonaire. You can zoom in a little bit there. And you can see some of these countries have not only lots of dive survey effort, but also lots of sightings. There's fairly high sightings frequency. In a place like Turks and Caicos, you've got like, 1 out of every 5 dives, you're seeing a reef-associated shark. That's pretty good. And we know from the finprint data as well that some of these countries on the far left of this plot, they're in pretty good shape. They're not that far off kind of, what we'd consider historical levels of abundance of these animals. The beauty, though, is to move beyond this comparison in space. That has been done. Finprint's done an incredible job of that with these baited video units. What we can do using reef data that is so unique is look at trends through time. We can make the transition to temporal trends. And time series data are unbelievably important. They are the backbone of sustainable fisheries management. They answer so many questions that we cannot answer otherwise, except by making lots and lots of assumptions. Right? These actually tell us how animals are doing in a place. Are there more or less? It is such a basic, fundamental question, and it's so difficult to answer in the ocean. Using time series, we can assess stocks, we can evaluate management decisions. For example, if a country decides to prohibit fishing on sharks and rays, what effect does that have? The only way you know is if you have data from before and after that event took place. You can forecast trends, and you can conduct conservation assessments. The problem is that time series often disagree. They often come from a very limited space. They don't represent the entire population or the entire range of the species. And they're often from a very limited amount of time. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. We're going to zoom in on these 2 species. They're very familiar to all of you, I'm sure. These are the most abundant reef-associated sharks in the Caribbean, the Atlantic nurse shark and Caribbean reef shark. And we can look at the inputs to those IUCN Red List assessments in the form of the only available time series from the Caribbean. And let me just emphasize, these species only occur in the Caribbean. These are the only time series available for these species on Earth. There are 3 for the Atlantic nurse shark in the past. One is from Belize using finprint data, those baited video units, across about 10 years. If you use only that information to assess the status of the Atlantic nurse shark, it would be considered least concern. If you used the time series from the Mexican Caribbean, which is aggregated landings data, meaning they don't take species-specific data, you're just looking at basically sharks coming to the dock through fisheries, over time, because of such a steep decline, you'd assume that the Atlantic nurse shark is critically endangered across its range. The third and final time series available during the last round of assessments comes from the US, from fishery-independent trawl data. Now, those are good data. I would argue there are flaws with all of these, and for this one, it's that trawls are probably not the ideal capture technique to assess nurse shark abundance. But we have some information. Based on that, in US waters, it would be least concern. The total IUCN Red List status of the Atlantic nurse shark across the Caribbean using these time series as well as expert input is vulnerable. So that is one of the threatened categories, which means in some countries where they lean on the Red List assessments, it would be prohibited from fishing. The Caribbean reef shark has only 2 time series. One is, again, Belize finprint. Based on a declining abundance at one particular reef in Belize, it would be assessed as critically endangered. And I love this time series because I worked on this early in my career in the Bahamas. We were setting fishery-independent long lines, and we saw that according to that alone, reef shark would be assessed as least concern. You combine that information, these 2 ends of the spectrum, the lowest assessment and the highest, as well as expert input, and it's assessed as endangered across its range. We need consistent survey effort across really large spatial scales and across really long temporal scales to really know how these animals are doing. These little snapshots are really good in a data-poor environment, but what if we had something so much better? The reef data. The reef data truly fills this gap, and I can't believe that it's been so underused within the shark and ray world because it's a treasure trove of information. And so to demonstrate that to you, we'll zoom in on just 3 countries that I think have really interesting stories, especially with these 2 species that actually differ in their ecology. There's a lot, we can learn a lot from studying these two species in these three places, the US, the Bahamas, and Belize.
What are the dots? Do you mind telling us?
Yes, that's a good question. So sightings frequency for us was across individual 1 kilometer square blocks within each country. And so we calculated sightings frequency for each one of those 1 kilometer square blocks within an EEZ. And then this is plotted showing you basically the distribution of those values. So any of these values that fall outside of the box are a little higher than most of them. It's a really good question. Okay, so looking at trends through time, we took a fairly complicated modeling approach that we can boil down to looking at basically presence or absence of one of these species on a survey that you guys have done, right? Is there or is there not a reef shark or Atlantic nurse shark? And we're looking at presence-absence as a function of variables that you guys measure, bottom time, water temperature, depth, habitat type, surveyor experience, as well as variables that we pull in that through past work we know are important predictors of whether sharks are there or not. Market gravity, basically how close are you to a big landing area, to a place where people are removing these species. MPA status, is it protected or not? That can include Shark Sanctuary, yes or no. And sea surface temperature anomaly to account for climate variability. We also account for unmeasured spatio-temporal processes, meaning survey effort in space and time, even within these countries, varies a lot. Maybe a big group of reef surveyors go to one part of the Bahamas for a few years and then they switch to the next a few years. You know, these things change over 30 years, and so we've accounted for that in our models. Ultimately, what we're going to be looking at now as our metric, instead of sighting frequency on all the future plots, is probability of occurrence of one of these two species on a given dive. How likely are you to see one of these sharks? And we'll start with the US. The US offers a very interesting case study, a very hopeful case study actually. It's highly engaged with the management toolbox. The US has some of the only sustainable shark fisheries on Earth. It's able to maintain both the vibrant ecotourism operations as well as those fisheries. You guys are familiar with this, I think, being in Florida. And it's also one of the only places where there has been evidence of recoveries of some shark species in US waters, which is very unique across the world. This really is a hope spot for sharks and rays. You can see that on this plot on the right from this paper, where in 1993, the US put in its fishery management plan for sharks in the Atlantic. Prior to 1993, the orange and red signify a lot of declines in these species. These are 11 wide-ranging coastal shark species that you guys have probably seen out here. 9 of the 11 show signs of stability or recovery after that management plan went into place, suggesting success, right? If we want to conserve sharks and rays, the US found a way to do it, and there's evidence that these recoveries have started. It raises a really interesting question in these places that, to me, is actually a wonderful problem to have. This question cannot be asked in most of the Caribbean, but here in Florida, people are asking it. Is there too much recovery? We've seen this in terrestrial ecosystems with things like grizzlies and wolves. You set a conservation target, maybe you overshoot it, people want to cull that population. Of course, you guys are familiar with Goliath groupers and black bears and all these things. It's happening with sharks now due to depredation. All these questions, you know, are there more sharks than ever? Why are they stealing the catch so often? Is it because the behavior's changed, because there are more fishermen, because the sharks have learned to follow fishing boats? These are questions that a lot of colleagues here in Florida are very focused on, as they should be. But I just want to emphasize, whenever people talk about this, it's often from a place of like a problem. But the fact that we're having this conversation is really good. This means we've done something right, here in the US at least. Now, when we look at that time series for Atlantic nurse shark from US waters, the bottom trawl data that I said wasn't necessarily ideal for looking at nurse shark abundance, we can see that this is one of those species that in coastal habitats seems to be doing all right. This is a time series going back to 1995. On all these plots, we're going to see an abundance index of some kind on the left. The higher it is, the more sharks in the place, and then time down on the bottom on the x-axis. And according to this time series alone, there is a very high probability that based on just what's happening in the US from this survey, nurse sharks are doing great across their range. It would be least concern, as I mentioned earlier. But this is, again, from one place, from one survey, using one gear type. A lot of time series disagree. How can reef survey data actually inform our broader understanding? Well, we have reef data from a lot of the keys. We've got 24,000 plus dives going back to 1993 in this region, covering the area. This is the perfect species to monitor with reef divers because you guys, it's a very easy species to ID. They don't move out of the way a whole lot. You see them, right? So they are really ideal. And I'm going to show you now the first trend line for nurse sharks from reef data in this project. And I just want to emphasize that I know it's just a line on a plot, but the fact that we can generate this line from reef data is truly like foundational. It will change the future of conservation for these species. The reef data is, and you guys may have seen all the sharks. We're giving out points for time series today. So it's, a point for everyone who's seen a nurse shark or hasn't seen one but recorded it in the keys. So we've got probability of occurrence here and then going through time from here 1994 to 2024. And you can see that there are two things on the plot, on all these plots with the reef data. There's going to be the dashed line. That's the raw data. That's the occurrence probability from the raw data. And the other one, the solid line with the gray shade, that's the model output plus the confidence interval. So you can think of this as like, basically, there's our model, what our model is saying was happening at a time, and then what divers were seeing. And if those things align pretty well, that gives you a sense of confidence of like, all right, the models aren't suggesting something crazy. It aligns pretty well with what the divers are seeing. There's going to be a little less variability in that line, and that's a good thing because we're accounting for more factors. So the trend in nurse shark in the US, oscillating but generally stable. This is another species that we can add to that list of animals doing well in the US. And when you overlay survey data from NOAA, from those bottom trawls, you see that there's pretty good agreement there. In the same years it goes up, in the same years it goes down. You add in data from Greenberg et al., which is an incredible paper that used reef data as well, and compared to underwater visual survey data from professional marine scientists at NOAA, there's also really good agreement. Right? Now this is just, I'm going to have some chicken scratch on a lot of these, but we can formalize this in the future. This is all preliminary, but there's really good agreement, and that gives us a lot of faith that in places where these time series from the past don't exist, we can trust the reef data. The citizen sciences data is robust. For the Caribbean reef shark in US waters, there are no US time series that exist. Folks put it on the prohibited species list in 2006, and we have no clue how that species has been doing before or after until now. This is the first time series for reef shark in US waters that I'm aware of in existence. Again, it presents a really good story. There's a rising probability of occurrence through time. It seems like since 2006, there has been a slight uptick. So this is one of those species we can also add to the list. Let's shift to Belize, where there's a completely different context. The Belize has a lot of mixed use. There are targeted shark fisheries, but really MPAs are the conservation tool of choice, these spatial protections. It's where you have, similar to the US, I suppose, you have the mix of ecotourism operations as well as the targeted shark fisheries. There's a lot of money coming in from a lot of different sectors, and they do a good job of trying to balance all these things out, except with far less institutional capacity and less funding than a country like the United States. So it might be a bigger lift. And the fin print data in Belize is coming from one particular place. It's called Glover's Reef. It's an atoll highlighted there on the map. And this is a place that's been a marine protected area for a long time. The two species of interest today have different ecologies. The Atlantic nurse shark and different fisheries management in the country. It's protected not only in the no-take areas, but also outside. It's protected at the national level. So if it's within or outside an MPA, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't be retained if it's caught in a fishery. But it also has high residency, so you don't expect it to leave the MPAs very much. You don't expect it to leave the country very much. If you see one day, you might see it there in the same spot the next. And the fin print data going back to 2009 shows us stable relative abundance through time. And I want to just thank Damian Chapman here, who's a PI on the fin print project. He's a shark scientist at Moat. He sent us, he heard this talk was happening, and he got really excited about this, and he shared the latest fin print data with us from 2021 to 2024. And it's nice to see this stability extend through the years after COVID in Belize. So that's a really good sign. We've added some more data there. Again, according to this data set alone, nurse shark would be least concern in the Caribbean. But it's only one site. What's happening across the entirety of Belize? The reef data offer those surveys, not only from Glover's Reef, but from Lighthouse and from all these other places, ambergris, etc. 3,000 plus surveys over the last 30 years. And we can model that, and we can see a trend in Atlantic nurse shark that is, again, very positive. We're seeing a rising probability of occurrence through time across not only Glover's Reef, but other reefs in Belize. And that's really good, and there's really good agreement between these two time series as well. I want to emphasize, though, that the spatial scope has expanded, and on top of that, we have gone back in time to look at the historical context for the species from before the fin print data was being collected. So now we know not only what the abundance of this shark is at Glover's Reef today, but we can get a sense of what it was like back in the mid-1990s. We can also look at the change in occurrence probability in any of these series from the beginning to the end of the series. And when you plot that, you can see that it's about 10-12% increase in the likelihood of seeing an Atlantic nurse shark in Belize over this 30-year period. That's really good for a species that Belize wants to protect, that brings in ecotourism dollars, that the fishermen don't really want. It's a really good sign. How about Caribbean reef shark in Belize? Slightly different story. There's lower residency. If you catch one inside an MPA one day and release it, you might catch it miles outside the next. It moves a bit more than the nurse shark. It's still probably not going to leave Belize, but it's not protected in Belize. It's only protected in the no-take areas. So when it leaves those MPAs, it can be caught and harvested for meat. The fin print data used in the IUCN Red List assessment that was done most recently shows an alarming trend in these Caribbean reef sharks, even within Glover's Reef, within the MPA, suggesting that as they leave the MPA, they do get caught by fisheries, and there's declining abundance from 2009 to 2019. Based on that alone, this shark should be assessed as critically endangered, right? This is a very alarming trend. But Belize did something that's pretty fantastic. This is another example of conservation success. In Belize, fishermen and nonprofits and the Belizean Fisheries Department came together around the time of COVID. They banned gill nets in the country. They also put in fishing bans, due in part to the data I just showed you, around 3 different atolls around Belize, including Glover's Reef. As a result, when you add in the latest data, you see that some of that relative abundance comes back. These sharks have been reappearing on reefs in Belize from this data from Glover's Reef, Belize. And so that's really, really exciting. This is a case of a country that, again, there's not this huge budget for fisheries management, and yet when people come together around this type of idea, and I should add actually that a lot of these scientists and NGOs were working with the shark fishermen and converting those operations to being part of the research process. So people who back in the 2010s were fishing for sharks in the early 2020s were actually putting out tags on these sharks. How cool is that? But again, I want to emphasize a few points through this that the reef data can solve. Long time series are critical, because what if you just stopped in 2019 and you assume there's no more reef sharks? You add a few years of data and you see that they actually came back. Lo and behold, when you look at the reef data going back to the 1990s, you see a rising probability of occurrence across the whole country in time, and there's good agreement even during this period where they seem to disappear from Glover's. Sightings frequency went down around the whole country in that time. But in the years since, there's agreement between these trends that reef sharks have started to come back, probably as a result of these management decisions. The change in occurrence probability, again, very positive over the time series from beginning to end, over 10%. The last case study I want to provide you with is from the Bahamas. This is where I lived and worked for a long time, so I absolutely love this place. It's so beautiful, and their story is unique. It's right here in this continuum of fisheries management engagement, but that's really because they've gone with this blanket approach. They don't have like all these different laws in place, they just have a couple. Major decision, 1993, they banned longline gear. That is the gear type that's most likely to lead to shark mortality. That is the biggest problem for sharks when it comes to, if you compare longlining to trawling to whatever else. So they banned that in 1993, and I should mention even before that, there's very little shark fishing in the first place. 2011, they make the whole country, all of the EEZ, safe for sharks. It's a shark sanctuary. Nobody can catch them, nobody can import them, export them, none of that. They lean in on ecotourism. Ecotourism related to shark diving specifically in the Bahamas brings in over $100 million every year. And the number one species that people want to come swim and dive with is the Caribbean reef shark, our species of interest today. Really cool point from this study showed us that a lot of dive ecotourism dollars actually go to the out islands in the Bahamas, the places that are not Nassau, not New Providence, but these islands that are actually the most economically impoverished in the country are the places where people go to the most to swim with sharks and dump money into those places. Really cool story there. The Bahamas faces an issue a lot of these sanctuary countries face, which is that people constantly are questioning whether the sanctuary should exist. Should we keep protecting sharks? In the Bahamas, this really rises to the surface every time there's a bite on somebody, which in the last 10 years or so, there have been quite a few. People then say, there's an explosion in shark populations. We need to do something about this. We need to cull the sharks, right? NGOs and the government come back and say, there's no scientific research that supports an increase in shark populations. I don't think this is the right answer to the problem of a couple people being bitten, as sad as that is. When they're saying that, they're referring to this study that we did in the eastern Bahamas where a sailboat full of high school students went out and set long lines in the 80s. It's called the Geronimo. They went out to this particular spot and set long lines day after day. They caught lots of tiger sharks, lots of reef sharks. We found that old data set. We knew Stevie Conant, who was the captain of that boat, and we went out with him and fished the exact same way in 2011 to 2013 to see if we'd catch similar numbers of sharks that they did back then. What we found for reef sharks is that we caught a few more per set. Based on our data from this particular place, with this huge gap in the time series, at this one little site in the eastern Bahamas, the IUCN Red List status would be least concern because it seems like they're doing okay. At least stability is how we refer to it. But what's going on as a result of these two decisions? We can't say anything about whether the longline ban or sanctuary really had an effect because there's so much missing data. You see where I'm going with this. Reef data comes to the rescue. We've got thousands of surveys across the Bahamas, not only at this little place called The Bridge where we did our longline survey, but across the Bahamas through time. And we can look at the reef shark trend there for the whole country. Rising probability of occurrence across the 30 years. I wouldn't call it an explosion, but it corresponds pretty well to what we were seeing in our longline data. There are a few more than there used to be. That change in occurrence probability is positive, something like 8% between these first few years to the last few years. I wouldn't call that an explosion, but it is a sign of conservation success in a place that never had shark fisheries to begin with and wants sharks and rays available for tourism. The other really cool thing that we can do with these data is look at the effect of specific decisions. We can look before and after something like a shark sanctuary designation because we have such a long time series, and we can parse out this little hump right here to say how much of that change in occurrence was before and how much was after. If the sanctuary has a big effect, you might assume that before the sanctuary you'd see even a decrease in the population, and afterwards you'd see some massive increase, right? It turns out that's not what we see in the Bahamas. When we split it up into pre-sanctuary and post-sanctuary years, we find that there was an increase in occurrence probability during both of those chunks of time. The probability of seeing a reef shark in the Bahamas has gone up since 1993, pretty continuously with a slight uptick after the sanctuary went into place. Once we publish these data, this will be the first information that the Bahamas can actually use to say what the effect of the shark sanctuary really is. Hopefully I've demonstrated that for each of these species, time series can vary between places and through time, and the reef data can offer us some invaluable information in doing conservation planning in the future. From the work that we've done and are working on continuously now in the lab, we can add 9 new time series to this list for the Atlantic nurse shark across its range. We'll go from 3 to 12 time series from which to base assessments in the future. For the Caribbean reef shark, we'll add 7 new time series from 7 different countries, going from 2 to 9 that can be used for conservation planning for that species, the most common shark species on reefs in the Caribbean. But we aren't going to stop with just sharks. There are reef-associated rays as well. The 3 most common are the white-spotted eagle ray, southern stingray, and the yellow stingray. And we can do the same thing for them. And we've screened all these countries to look for places where you guys have spent a lot of time, where there's good spatial coverage within the EEZ and there's good temporal coverage, enough to build a time series for that place. And ultimately, we can provide time series for 6 new countries in the Caribbean prior to this study where there is no information on how sharks and rays are doing now or were doing in the past, ultimately adding 40 new time series for these 5 species in the Caribbean that extend 30 years. Bottom line, if you are a reef surveyor, please continue to collect this information. It is truly invaluable, and I think for sharks and rays, it's going to prove to be very, very important for a healthy future. Thank you very much.
positive stories. We have plenty of time for questions. We've got a couple of mics in the background. So if anybody has a question, raise your hand.
I can do it without a mic because I have a booming voice.
Oh, I think we need it for the live
Oh, we
stream.
need it for this.
Yes, so booming voice.
Here we go. Mic time. I know anecdotally anyway that the yellow stingray has been having problems recently, and I noticed that was one of your target species here for rays. Can you just give us a brief touch on what's going on with the yellow stingray?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So there have been a few papers on sharks and rays using reef data in the past, and those previously have been some of the only information we have from these countries. One is for the yellow stingray, where there was evidence from the Ward Page paper that yellow stingray abundance has gone down through time in the Caribbean. We've seen a continuation of that trend. So there are fewer yellow stingrays being encountered by reef divers now than in the past, but the biggest period of decline was in the 90s and early 2000s. So if you look at the trends that are published already, we would basically just add on to that a continuation. It's not going down more and more, but it's at a very low level. So there's no evidence of recovery for that species. Why that's happening, we don't know. There are some interesting ways we can play with this data to see how maybe the recovery of yellow stingray predators, like some of these sharks, might track inversely with the decline in yellow stingrays. It does line up in time and space pretty well, but it's difficult to attribute one to the other. But maybe the two trends suggest some relationship there.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Brandon, am I got the mic? Excellent talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could explain to us how the fin print system actually works, and is it accurate to assume that AI is revolutionizing that system? It's not clear to me how the fin print data is actually collected.
Sure, yeah. The fin print data is collected by researchers all over the world going out and deploying typically a GoPro on a big rig and a bait arm with a set amount of chopped up fish inside. So you can deploy that unit, let's say for an hour, and record the number of sharks that swim by. They use a metric called max N, which is the maximum number of sharks maximum number of the same species within a given frame throughout the whole deployment of that unit. And so they can look at max N and compare that between these deployments. They do enough of them that they can then compare between countries even and highlight the places in space where you expect to see lots of sharks or expect to see very few.
And has a system been developed using AI to do that comparative analysis? If not, it seems that it's a technology that's likely to evolve. I'm hoping so.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was involved in fin print on the periphery in the past at a time when a lot of volunteers were watching the footage and recording what they saw. I'm sure that they have leaned into AI as a tool to get that done more efficiently, but I couldn't tell you how far they are. You're welcome.
Yes, I had two questions. Number one, because of you're attempting to get more confidence in your sample populations, needing more data, right? Data is king and queen. So with all the dive companies we have down here and the coverage of reef and dive locations, I'm wondering if some of the dive companies wouldn't just cooperate by turning in a quick report. We have reports like rainbow reports on weather conditions, whatever. If somebody reported on maybe you picked your top 6 and you got a report per dive site every day like that, I'm sure they'd cooperate, and especially if they received a nice massage from social media. That might be a way to get more data. I used to be in charge of AI research for surveillance for federal law enforcement. So I had worked in the facial recognition, video analytics, and detection area, and I know it's very hard to get data. The second thing, as a diver, I'm seeing more sharks, especially Caribbean, gray reefs, on select wrecks. and bull sharks, primarily because of, I believe, fishing habits, because of chumming during fishing, and they seem to be collection points. I've had them come up and actually brush my lens multiple times on a dive. So I'm wondering if those may be nice sites if you're going to start to try and mark. Especially the Spiegel is the gold standard for Caribbeans, with the Dwayne and bib, and sometimes eagle during fishing for bull sharks. Those are just a couple of things to think about.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate it. I think, those are really good points. It would be wonderful if more dive shops around not only the Caribbean but the world knew about reef surveys and committed to it, because there is no other option that covers so much space and time. And if people could jump in and contribute, it's the best way people can make a difference. Like as citizen scientists, going about their business, doing stuff they love to do.
Ecotourism and money is key. It's just getting
people
the
wanna
social
help, right?
media support to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of expanding on the gentleman's question in front of me, do GIS software specifically ever play a large role in specifically the plotting and analysis of this data?
Absolutely. Yeah. We're not using GIS so much to analyze the data for this project, but we do a lot of our work in R, which has a lot of its own kind of geospatial packages that you can use to do very similar things. So it's very useful. We use it all the time, especially to make like publication-ready maps is where I lean on GIS the most. Yeah.
I'm a long-term resident here, but have moved up to the Mississippi coast. One of the things that's shocking to me is fishing rodeos just around ramps, the amount of people who are proud to be bringing up sharks and throwing them away. One of the things that I think would be helpful, because you don't want to be confrontive, but if we had some kind of card that had information that you could direct people online to what's happening with sharks, what's happening with rays in their own backyard. I try to do it, but again, some kind of like, it's not just for divers, but for people who are in a fishing situation. So if you could provide something like that, that'd be a good or helpful thing that the man on the street could help with.
Yeah, thank you. We can talk about that. There are some great folks in Mississippi that work at the universities and at Sea Grant who do a lot of this stuff and are often at the rodeos, and they'll go to collect data on the animals that are brought to the dock and collect samples and at least make use of it scientifically as much as they can.
But it's too late for the shark.
Yeah, that's true.
And really, down here in the Keys, we were always catch and release. When I got up to Mississippi and found out how many species they were bringing in for show, when we'll catch a sailfish and hang a flag, but they bring them in, and there was no shame.
Yeah.
And I use that term shame, but I try to tell them, what's going on in a nice way.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. I have my own personal feelings about this. This comes down to a lot of value questions, I think, and it varies person to person. As a scientist, I would just point to the limits that are set by the state and federal agencies within, especially this part of the U.S. around sharks, that lots of the species that they are bringing in are the species on that list that have exhibited some preliminary recoveries. So just to, I don't know, I struggle with this myself, balancing what the data say with like what I feel should be happening and what's right, especially bringing in a big predator. I have my own feelings about that too, but it's important to keep the data in mind as well. And for a lot of those species, there are catch limits in place and size limits in place, and they're operating within the law.
Right here. The mic. Personally, I've always seen more sharks paddleboarding and kayaking in the shallows of South Florida than I ever do out snorkeling on the reefs or diving. So do you try to collect data from those areas, or is that of value?
We don't have a protocol, to my knowledge, for collecting data from, paddle boards or kayaks or anything.
But maybe a survey could be expanded to there. Just an idea.
Yeah, definitely something for REEF to think about.
Hi. Over the course of these 30-year surveys that you've been talking about, like from the mid-90s till now, how much of the techniques of doing the surveys changed from the early part to the late part of these surveys, and might that be a factor in the results that they found?
To my knowledge, the REEF survey protocol has been very consistent through time, and that's part of the, people often change surveys every few years, something will change, and it's so frustrating because then you can't compare, or you have to do a new study where you compare two techniques to correlate one with the other. Part of the beauty of the REEF data is that it's been consistent this whole time, and so we have this very clear metric of occurrence probability that we can use for a dive today and from 1995.
And how do you prevent against, maybe I don't have a really good concept of how these surveys are done. How do you prevent against counting the same sharks more than once?
That's a good question. We thought about this kind of thing a lot. And that's part of why we landed on this metric called occurrence probability, where we're not interested in how many sharks are being seen on a dive. We're just interested if you saw a nurse shark on a dive or a reef shark on a dive. If so, it's present. And so we're just looking at presence absence. And that's it. So we try to account for that in this way.
Is that really the best way to do it?
It's one way to do it. There's always a million ways. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do one more question. Brendan's going to be with us all weekend and during the break, so you can question. So one more question. One on the front row there.
Thanks, Dr. Brennan. My question's about the animal that's been around for 500 million years now. We're looking at a lot of this stuff and comparing it to the trends of the 90s. That's our only data baseline. But how confident are we that that's a healthy baseline that we should be assessing based off of?
We're not very confident in that at all. That's a recurring problem. There's some really interesting work that looks at the deposition of dermal denticles, shark scales in sediments going back thousands of years in the Caribbean. And there's evidence that even pre-industrial fishing, the abundance of sharks had already gone down enormously just from human populations that were here, in the 1400s and even before that. So yeah, there are probably far fewer sharks and rays in our oceans, or were in the 90s at the start of this series, than there were hundreds of years ago. That's just a question that's really difficult to answer. And now there has to be some balance where, there are fishermen out there. There are people who want to spend time underwater. At some point, that issue that we face with wolves and grizzlies comes into play, where the baseline's important, but also we have to find, whether we like it or not, we are in control of the natural world at this point. And so we have to decide as a community in each place, what is the appropriate level for these predators based on all our other needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And the availability and the baselines of the other species along the entire food chain is going to matter into that. Have you taken any of that past data, the paleoceanographic data, and tried to compare that or incorporate that in any of your models?
I have not. No, I'd be interested to do that. All my work to date has really been about this pressing threat of overfishing in recent decades, because that's where populations, at least in the last 100 or 200 years, this section of time since the 1980s is when they've really plummeted. So maybe the baselines differ, but if you look at the baseline of the 1950s, there's been a huge change. So how do we get back closer to that at least, if that's our goal?
You.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, it's wonderful to see all of you here. If you are willing to, if you see an empty seat next to you, if you would be willing to close in those gaps, we have a few people that are downstairs watching this seminar, our lectures.